Okay, Tim, are you ready to roll?
Ready when you are, Spencer, yes.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So let's just quickly tell you a little bit about what the plan is for tonight. So the plan is very much to, first of all, thank Tim very much for joining us. Tim has been a long friend of Cocoa Runners. We're hugely fans also of all of his work, and he's just produced a great new book, which I'm sure you all know about. And the aim is to try and sort of explore a little bit about craft chocolate and some of his favorite craft chocolates, and use that as a sort of a tool to get him to articulate a little bit some of those myths that he is so keen on debunking and getting into. Before we do that, we will do a little bit on basically just the art and science of chocolate tasting, which will be good. There is a quiz at the end of the competition, at the end of the presentation too. And during the presentation too, as you taste the chocolate, one of the things that we are quite keen on getting you to do is to basically give us your impressions, so that if you basically can enter those into your phone using something called menti.com, we will explain when we get there. We will hopefully get your impressions. One last and quite important bit is that if any of you have allergies, there are some milk chocolates at the end of the presentation which look like this. We will walk you through those when we get to it. But if you are lactose sensitive, please don't have those. But as I said, the main aim here is to basically chat to Tim, get him to tell us a little bit about his book, a little bit about some of his favorite chocolates, and try and use chocolate to explain and articulate some of the greater misconceptions that people have about chocolate. So what we're going to do is we're first of all going to talk a little bit about how you savor chocolate. Then we're going to explore some sort of lightly roasted chocolate to get into the whole sort of science of cooking and all the goods and bads there. And Tim, I know, has got lots of stuff there. And then, as you all know, Tim is also an expert on sugar and stuff like that. So we're going to talk a bit about that. But then really sort of dive into the meat of understanding really what is quality in products and how you can tell and what you can tell. And then talk a bit about fat and the bliss point. Yep. So without further ado, the first thing we'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is we're going to get you to talk a little bit about tasting. Tim is an expert on this one already. So you need this chocolate bar, or if you've got the smaller one, this one. And what we'd like you to do is to open up the bar and grab a bit of it. But what I don't want you to do is to eat it quite yet. Tim has almost got it in his mouth, but he's almost there. And Tim is an expert on this. So what we really want you to do is to basically hold your nose while you grab a piece of chocolate and just suck it, if you can. And try not to asphyxiate yourself. And while you're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about this chocolate, which is quite difficult to do when you're holding your nose. But anyway, it's made in Orford by a guy called Chris Brandon and his daughter Joanna, and a tank commander called Rob Sedmore. And it's made from beans which are grown very close to where Chris was originally born, in Jamaica. Now, hopefully you haven't all asphyxiated. But what I'd love you to do now is to basically release your nose. And what you should suddenly discover is one of the magic bits of cocoa butter, or as Tim will explain in a minute, what we could actually call cocoa margarine. I don't know, Tim, you want to go on to that in a minute. But what we're really exploring here is the difference between taste, which is a series of receptors you have all through your mouth, mainly on your tongue, but also which go all the way down to your gut, which is obviously another one of Tim's great expert areas. But it's completely different to what we normally associate with enjoying things like chocolate, which is really more about flavor. And flavor is something which you get through your sense of smell, your olfactory system, which is both orthonasal, i.e. the stuff you sniff, which is why when you have a glass of wine, you swill it around. But it's also the stuff,
Tim Spector.
But it's also the stuff that you get when you basically swallow some chocolate, because what's happening is that the chocolate's melting. The cocoa butter is effectively melting because your body temperature is causing it to dissipate and break its crystalline structure and release all the aromas, which is what gives it that flavor. The other thing, which is actually sort of quite important when you taste, and we're going to get you now to start using Mentimeter, is basically there's a huge difference between scoffing and eating very, very quickly on the one hand, and then savoring on the other. So what we'd love you to do, if you don't mind, is go to something called menti.com, and we will basically put this there. And basically, if you type in the numbers 74, 03, 05 and 9, and basically, and I'll probably get Tim just to sort of shout out what senses he's getting as he scoffs a bit of chocolate, but we want you to eat it incredibly fast. And just basically, if you can just tell us what sensations you get from eating chocolate really fast, what you can sort of detect as you do that. And hopefully you're all on sort of Mentimeter. Tim, you're going not quickly enough. So what have you got? You shouldn't really be able to get much flavor. We just want you just to really just sort of try and grab the taste. Rich, yeah, that's great.
Creamy, waxy, smooth, slightly bit of nutty.
Nutty. Okay, I think we all have enough time to do that. But what's interesting is you are picking up things like bitter, creamy, buttery, smooth. What we'd now like to do is basically try and talk to you a little bit more about actually one of the ways that we think you should savor all foods, but in particular chocolate, which is basically by almost sort of breaking it down into the different waves that you get. So Tim, this is actually dedicated to you because what people may or may not know is that Tim is a massively keen surfer. And an expert of swimming as well. And what we'd like to do is sort of use that analogy to basically talk about how what happens when you eat a piece of chocolate, when you savor a piece of chocolate, is that it starts with a little bit of texture and taste. You get a bit of melt. But then as you sort of rise through the wave, you get all these sort of great flavors just sort of crashing all over you. And then it sort of lasts and sort of goes on, and you sort of start to get all sorts of other sensations. Like you may get some complexity, you may get some balance, you may get a little bit of astringency even coming through. And what I'd now like to do is actually just take that piece of chocolate, because we're not going to allow you to scoff it anymore. We just like you to savor it and see whether or not actually using this tasting wave. So you should have this piece of paper in your handout, and on it we're basically giving you these words, because one of the strange things about flavor and taste is that people generally struggle a little bit with actually how to articulate it. Unlike things like sort of describing a book or a piece of music or, you know, anything else like that, it's much, much, much easier to articulate those than it is chocolate. Obviously, you've still got the words on the tip of your tongue. So as you're thinking about the chocolate, one thing which is quite fun to do is to basically just try and articulate it to your friends. So there you go. That's the flavor wave to try and get you to do it. And now, Tim, now you've got your chance to sort of savor the chocolate a little bit more. And maybe what you want to do is talk a bit about cocoa margarine too, or not really?
Yeah, well, I mean, the other analogy, of course, with this wave is all about, is like anyone who does wine tasting. The difference between a cheap wine and an expensive wine is often that first hit is often the same, but it doesn't carry on. So we should all be picking up is the fact that there is this wave. Any good chocolate is quite long, and you're going to get slightly different flavors as the different chemicals break down in your mouth. And I think that's really important here. Hopefully you're still enjoying your smooth chocolate. Our idea of the wave is that the first one is that rather simple, very basic taste that you get of the first bit, which is perhaps the receptors, now telling you how sweet it is or how bitter or sour, and a mixture of those, but it's all the chemicals as they unwind, as your saliva breaks them down in your mouth with the microbes there to produce this complexity of flavors. And that's really what we're tasting here.
Should we talk a little bit about the next chocolate, which we're going to move into now, which is we're also going to try and savor, which is basically the connections, which is basically a good example of talking about cooking and talking about roasting and what you do there with chocolate. But what I'm going to just quickly do is just stop sharing for 1 second, just try and clean up the screen. Tim, are you okay just to talk a little bit about myths about while you're tasting this chocolate? And this is an example of what we would sort of call basically not a raw chocolate, but it has all the stuff that people think about when they're talking about cooking and myths and raw chocolates with those.
Yeah, so in a way, so this is a 70% medium roast chocolate. And the idea was to talk a bit about the whole idea about raw foods being more nutritious than cooked ones.
Yep, the idea is very much to be doing.
So the basic concept that many people think raw vegetables, for example, are more nutritious than cooked ones. And in fact, the data don't support that generally, when you're eating a vegetable that's slightly steamed, often you get more of the nutrients and more of the good chemicals that are good for your gut microbes than you do in the purely raw form. And so this is a bit of a myth put about by the raw food movement that like to do this. So I think it's important to bear this in mind, that there's nothing necessarily wrong with raw food or eating a raw carrot, but the idea that all your food needs to be raw to be healthy is completely wrong. And many cooked foods, and even ones that are frozen, don't necessarily have more nutrients, and often have more nutrients than others. And the other real thing we're talking about here, which I could probably discuss polyphenols now.
Yep.
Spencer, if that's good.
That's absolutely, if you want to. I mean, what we were just going to try and just quickly sort of try and say, this is an Ecuadorian chocolate, and Ecuador is sort of well known for this sort of angle of being sort of quite winey and quite earthy. But the other angle to it, which is sort of quite interesting, is the idea. It's where raw chocolate originally comes from. So raw chocolate, sort of very much what Tim was sort of saying, jumped on this idea that somehow raw is better for you. And one of the strange things about raw is that actually there is no classic definitions for what it means. It generally is thought to mean that it doesn't go above human body temperature, but it's actually struggling with that. But there are, as Tim sort of said, all sorts of extraordinary claims made about it, most of which are complete, don't really bear up. So it's a good example of what Tim was sort of talking about, the idea that somehow cooking lots of stuff is going to destroy the nutrients is absolutely not the case. And there are certain foods actually when it increases, like with tomatoes and stuff like that. And chocolate actually, interestingly, and maybe we can talk a bit about sort of the polyphenols and also the fermentation here, Tim, is that basically the thing which gives chocolate its flavor, if you've ever basically had a cocoa seed before it's fermented, it doesn't taste anything like chocolate. It's incredibly bitter. It's incredibly astringent. And it's actually the fermentation which actually brings out all the flavors that you should be able to sort of get to and enjoy. So I mean, and actually the guy who invented it is this great guy, Santiago Peralta, back in 2009. But he actually now admits that basically he doesn't really do what you would normally think of as being raw. The one thing he does do, which is quite cool, is that he actually basically microfinances donkeys for the farmers to be able to sort of schlep all their fermenting pods down to the farm and sort of make it into chocolate. But I mean, Tim, let's talk a little bit more maybe about fermentation at this point and some of the stuff that you want to do.
I mean, what's interesting is we've only in sort of recent history worked out what fermentation is. It's, the action of microbes on food to basically change it from one chemical or one food type to another. And in the past, our ancestors didn't know about microbes because they thought it was a form of magic, that suddenly if you let berries fall from the tree and left them there long enough, they could become alcohol. And the same happened with coffee beans and with cocoa, and so that it was called cold cooking was how it was actually referred to. So I think when we're talking about raw food or cooked food, I think it's interesting to think of fermentation as a form of cold, slow cooking. And that's, in fact, what's happening, because we're changing the composition of the food or the substance of the plant by essentially adding microbes. And that's what's happening every day in all of us, inside our guts and in nature, degrading of nature and compost and changing fruits as they go rotten. So in a way, we're surrounded by cookery everywhere. So that's perhaps a good way of thinking about this whole concept of raw and cooked, and seeing fermentation as somewhere on the middle between roasting and raw. It's a part of the process, and that's why previously it was called cold cooking.
Yeah, and I think the great thing to think about with chocolate is that you can have great chocolate, such as this stuff which Jenny's sort of created, and it will give you all the flavors that you associate with this particular varietal, with this particular bean, and you can actually play with the roast just as you can with coffee. But the idea that it's somehow raw is just nonsense, because by definition, you cannot actually sort of create chocolate. You can't turn the seeds into beans. without actually, getting around all the stuff that people normally think about with that. Tim, the other thing that we wanted to talk a little bit about, because you're famous for your sort of views, and I think quite rightly, on a lot of the things which people sort of unfairly accuse sugar of doing. And we actually, in the chocolate industry, we actually think sugar is actually a great thing, a little bit of it at least. And maybe what we can do is just basically put everybody through. For those of you who aren't experts yet in the world of 100% chocolate, we're going to start you off gently, because what we'd love you to do is basically just try some cocoa nibs. So you've got in front of you a bar here, which is Menical salt and nibs. If you don't have it, don't worry, but you should have it if you've got one of the tasting sets. And what we'd actually like to do in this case is actually open it up, but don't eat the chocolate yet. What we'd actually like to do is scrape off the back of it the cocoa nibs. So on the back of this chocolate are actually what chocolate is made out of, which are those beans and those seeds that we were talking about earlier on. They've been roasted at this point, and they've just been added on top of the chocolate at this point, just to give you a little bit of the sense as to actually what happens when you add sugar. But we're going to just start by just getting you to choose some cocoa nibs. You will need a glass of water at some point pretty soon. And just see what happens to your mouth. And Tim is already sort of reaching for the solution to the next bit of the problem, which is a glass of wine. And so any of you who have glasses of wine, this is your ideal excuse to have that. And then once you've got through those nibs, the next thing we'd like to do is to sort of go up a level, which is actually to take those nibs and try them when they've been converted into 100% chocolate bar. Now, we've only given you small squares of this chocolate bar, but for those of you who love it, you can sort of see it up on the screen as the big bar. I strongly recommend that if you're not used to 100% chocolate, that you just take a very little part of this to start with. So you just take a little bit of it and then put it on your tongue and wait for it to melt. And this is one good area where it's really neat to actually have everybody that you can sort of see on the screen. Because what you should discover, we talked about the difference between taste and flavor about when we were first going through the Pump Street chocolate. What we're now going to do is add another dimension to that, which is that there are lots of things which we eat which give us sensations which are neither taste nor flavor. So, for example, spicy food is actually trigeminal, and very strong red wines or very strong coffees and 100% chocolate are all what we call astringency. So Tim is almost at this phase, but what we're expecting is that lots of you will actually be feeling a little bit like this, which is what's actually happening here is that the tannins in the chocolate are actually pulling the saliva out of your mouth. But what they're actually is they're coagulating the proteins in the saliva in your mouth. And that's what gives it this sort of incredibly drying, or what's called astringent, which actually means to bind. That's what's creating this sensation. Now, the interesting thing about chocolate is that actually now we can go back and try the salt and nibs, which has got a little bit of sugar added to it. And then what you should discover is that actually it starts to taste, and you can start to pull out all the flavors to it. Now, interestingly, when you've eaten quite a bit of 100%, you actually get quite used to dealing with that astringency sense. And what Tim was doing earlier on, which is actually having some red wine, is an extremely good idea, because what you're actually doing is the brain sort of uses astringency almost as a means to sort of warn you that some of these fruits or some of the stuff that you're about to try is maybe not quite ripe enough for you to have. That's the reason why, for example, unripe bananas are very astringent. But actually the brain can switch off after you've sort of eaten quite a bit of astringency, like a tanninic red wine. It will say, okay, we've given you that message. We're going to stop telling you stuff's astringent. And then if you have some chocolate, you can actually start to get more of the flavors out of it. But anyway, enough on that. While you savor the salt and nibs, and if you are into the 100%, while you savor that, what I think Tim might want to do now is to sort of talk a bit about some of the misapprehensions with sugar too. First of all, Tim, did you like that 100%?
I liked it after my glass of wine, yeah.
That is the secret to it. Either that or a coffee bean.
Not before. But yeah, I'd be interested to see what other people thought about it. But what's interesting also to bear in mind, because this is also true of a strong red wine, a tannic wine, as you said, certain fruits, and some bitter vegetables as well. You get a similar feeling. And actually, the chemicals behind them are actually really good for you. So it's one of those strange things that if it doesn't poison you, it's really good for you, because they are what's giving you what we call tannins are actually these group of chemicals called polyphenols, which are in many plants, more in some than others. And if you eat them, they are like rocket fuel for your gut microbes. So they're really healthy. So that's what we think gives coffee and chocolate its particular health benefits, because of the rich amount of these plant chemicals that come through. And that's why you want to have some bitterness, some astringency, because you know there's a good concentration of these healthy chemicals. And it's just a question of how much you get used to. But as Spencer says, you can build up from 12% in a Hershey bar to 100%, but you've got to do it gradually. You can't do it very quickly. And the myth about sugar, people say sugar is is bad for you, and of course it is in excess, and it is when it's added to all processed foods to disguise some of the taste, or when there's low-fat foods, it's often added to make it much more acceptable, because it sort of distracts your brain. But within things like chocolate, once you get to a small amount of that in, it really is not particularly harmful. And there's some interesting facts that diet drinks, for example, aren't any healthier for you than the full sugar drinks, apart from for your teeth, because just swapping one sweetener for another, even though you're getting less calories, is not better for you, because those artificial sweeteners have very negative effects. And I think that's one thing where we're learning. So beware of some of these new chocolate bars that contain artificial sweeteners. There's no evidence they're actually better for you, and they might be doing other things to your body and upsetting your gut health. And in trials, when they give kids, they swap kids from having regular Coke or Pepsi and Fanta to the diet versions, they don't lose any weight. There's no difference. So beware of this new trend that is undoubtedly going to happen by seeing more and more artificial sweeteners replacing sugar. You're probably better off, because we do know about sugar. We know what it does, and we know exactly how to deal with it. And when there's a small amount, like in these chocolates, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I think that's right. Just to sort of put it in context, when you think about a bar of chocolate like this one that you've got, actually, 60-70% bar of chocolate, which is 60 grams. Actually, the amount of chocolate inside here is 1 or 2 2 or 3 tablespoons. So it's actually less than you get in a low-fat single-serve yogurt. So, the myth about sugar and chocolate is, as Tim sort of says, cheap mass-produced chocolate uses a lot of sugar for lots of different reasons. One, which is that it's cheap. Another one, which is the way in which it sort of overstimulates you. But good craft chocolate actually has remarkably little sugar in comparison to many other products that we think about. Okay, so on that, the next thing we thought we'd actually try and do is just basically sort of, Tim has, we talk a little bit about quality in chocolate and how you actually sort of develop that. We need to think a little bit about what it is about crafting and all the different stages of how you grow chocolate and actually bring out the flavor, and actually what the difference is between processed food. So Tim, you may or may not know, is also an extremely keen skier, and lots of it in Canada, for example. So he actually chose a little bit of a bar made in Canada by one of the first craft chocolate companies called Soma. And this is an old school chocolate bar. And what we mean by that is, for those of you who haven't ever had stone ground chocolate, I think what you're going to discover is that this is actually very different. Okay, so this is the stone ground chocolate, which we tried earlier, which we're going to try now. And this is very much sort of talk with Tim about this one is extremely different to any of the other chocolates that you've tried so far, or you'll have again. And the reason for it is just because of the way in which it's crafted. So it's crafted the way that you would still get it if you go to South America. And just try it, and then we'll explain to you a little bit more about what it is that you get. So if you want to try again what's happening here and give us your sensations, that would be great. Yeah. Again, I think so what's interesting here is that, so just to give you the background on this sort of chocolate was actually invented by the Brits back in the 1840s. And before then, we were only drinking chocolate. And what they worked out and what they discovered was that you could add cocoa butter back into the stuff that people were using to make drinks and turn it into a stable solid. But it was extremely grainy, extremely sort of coarse, and it's very different to all of the other chocolates that we've got. And the reason for this, again, is just because of the way in which it's crafted. It's before the Swiss have worked out the magic of something which is called conching, which is basically what's done now mainly in the world of craft chocolate and what Indian lentil grinders or spice grinders, which is basically what Lindt discovered, which is that when you sort of take cocoa beans and you grind them for a very long period of time, what happens is they become this sort of wonderful smooth paste that you can see down at the bottom. But the other thing which happens is that, back to Tim's point about polyphenols and aromas, is that a bit like when you knead bread, what you're actually doing is you're bringing out all the flavors from that. And it creates a radically different texture, but also a radically different mouthfeel, which actually allows you to taste the different varieties of cacao and the different fermentations, which is what we're going to do now. But again, Tim, this is your bar for your skiing from Switzerland. And now what we'd like to do is just, again, remind you to think a little bit more about the flavor wave. And this time what we'd like to do is take two different bars. Now you may, depending on which pack you've got, either have the smaller bars from Tosier, or you may have the larger bars. And the first bar we'd like you to take is to Bolivia, which is this image here. And again, if you don't mind just going to Menti and just this time just focusing on the flavors, and again using the flavor wave just to sort of see what you get out of this Bolivian chocolate. So the maker for this chocolate is actually named after George I's personal chocolate maker, a guy called Thomas Tosier, who was one of 3 people to be given the keys to his bedroom, because every morning George I would basically wake up and Thomas Tosier would make him some hot chocolate and bring it to bed with him. And quite why that makes it a great name is intriguing, but it is, I think what you're already getting is this just shows you how different crafting chocolate will actually create completely different flavor profiles. Okay.
Spencer, could you just, some people believe that the actual outside texture and shape of chocolate changes your taste. So the Canadian one, felt very coarse on your tongue. And so I think your brain is also expecting something a bit drier and less rounded and, perhaps more likely to be savory or crunchy. Yeah. Whereas if it's round and smooth, you're more likely to up the sweetness as well. So that's what some of the food manufacturers have exploited in the shape of some of their chocolates and things.
Yeah, no, there's definitely, there's a lot of work going on that. You're absolutely right, Tim. So one of the interesting things is that people are now playing with different shapes to try and create different forms of sweetness. There is actually another sort of dimension to that too, which we can play, which is in your boxes, you should actually have, if you look, a couple of bits of Velcro on some of the boxes. And if you basically stroke the smooth Velcro and the rough Velcro as you are basically trying chocolate, some of you may discover that it actually radically changes your impression of that chocolate. And I know this sounds very strange, but the reason for it is that taste, flavor, chemosenses, they're all what are called multimodal, and they all bring back different associations. So just as different music may actually put you in different moods and make you appreciate things differently, actually your sense of touch also dramatically impacts how you will perceive and how you will interpret different flavors. So one thing which is sort of quite interesting is that as a kid, you will have been brought up not to eat with your hands, but you will have occasionally done it. And you will actually associate different flavors with your sense of touch. So that's the reason why, Tim, if you haven't got any, you're lucky you've got a bit of stubble there, so you could basically scratch your beard and see whether or not it makes a difference. But it should make a little bit of a difference. It definitely makes a difference when you drink wine too. But you are absolutely right that if you depending on how fast the chocolate melts, it will create a completely different flavor profile. So one of the interesting tricks that you can sort of play on somebody is to actually give them a very thin piece of chocolate and then a fat piece of chocolate, and they will basically think they're completely different sensations. And actually, they're not. They're exactly the same chocolate, but they're just melting for you differently. So we've got all these sensations now. What would now be sort of quite fun, I think, to try is to let's basically try a chocolate which is exactly the same percentage, crafted in exactly the same way, but it's completely different in terms of how it's going to taste and what flavors it's going to give, because it comes from different beans which have been fermented differently. So this time we're going to go to the Maya Mountain in Belize, but again, it's made by Tosier, Jonathan and Deanna. And again, let's get your sensations for this one. And while we're doing that, I'll also just talk a little bit more about what Tim was sort of talking about there, which is, it is extraordinary actually what you can do to confuse people when you give them different shapes to sort of taste and enjoy. In Japan, actually, they now produce chocolate bars which are molded deliberately with different textures on them to give you that. I think, though, that the reason why this chocolate, the stone ground chocolate, actually doesn't release the same flavors. So what's interesting here is that everybody's already immediately diving into what we call on the Great Tasting Way, the flavor profiles. And the reason why they're doing that is because the conching, the grinding under high temperature, is actually releasing all those polyphenols and all those aromas inside the chocolate, which creates and distinguishes all the different flavors that you've got. So there is no right or wrong, but it would also be intriguing to know. But I mean, I think you're all getting the fact that these are two radically different chocolates.
And a lot of it is I mean, we've done ones where the bean's actually the same, but they're fermented differently.
Yeah.
And so you can have exactly the same bean, but if it's fermented for a bit longer or in a slightly wetter condition, the microbes are going to be different and they will work differently on that food. And that's what's really interesting, is that's an analogy about why all of us are unique in terms of our own gut microbes. And so when we eat the same food, we're going to get not only different tastes because of the microbes in our mouth, but also that food is going to have a different effect on our body and our metabolism. And that's why this one size fits all type advice for our health doesn't work. And I think this is a great illustration of how virtually identical beans fermented differently are going to give you very different tastes. And that is just exactly like how any two of you are going to have a different reaction to the same bean because of your microbes are different. And this is just a really good way of showing it to everybody, because we can all see that they're giving us different flavors, which means essentially they're producing different chemicals. But we're not all getting the same flavor, which is interesting, and we're not supposed to, because we're all unique, and there'll be some in common, but I expect everyone will be getting something different. And that's why it's fun. And that's why these tastings are fun, because it's one of the few times you can do a live experiment on yourself. Anyway, they're both very nice. I don't know which one I prefer on those ones, but
no. But I think what is interesting is that even here you can sort of tell that people have got different flavor notes which they're pulling out in different ways because the size of the words are different. And if we go back to the stone ground, what you can see here is that people are really much more about the texture than they are about the flavor in this size, which I think is sort of the significant bit. And Tim talked a little bit about sort of what brings it out. And just to sort of, for those of you who sort of want to sort of get the technical bits to it, the things which really drive the flavor of different cocoa varietals is basically type of cacao, which is just like, different grapes will give you different flavors from different wines. And then again, as with wine, the different fermentations will give you very, very different flavors. So the different yeast, the different microbiomes, how long you do it for, etc. And then finally, actually, the way in which you dry it will also make a massive difference. So beans which are sun-dried will have a very different flavor profile to beans which are dried in places like Papua New Guinea or Indonesia, where it rains a lot and you've actually got to use fires to dry the beans, and they'll tend to be a bit smokier. Now, the interesting thing for us, and this is where it sort of segues back to chatting to Tim about processed food, is that one of the fascinating things about chocolate is that it actually has more flavor vectors and sort of, aspects to it than almost anything, including things like red wine. And yet it's also an amazing vector for flavor. So when we think about most mass-produced chocolate, what is it? What's absolutely fascinating is that chocolate's almost become like a commodity. It's almost like sort of the way that vegetable fat is used or sugar is used, and it's used as a vector for flavor. So everybody loves Terry's Chocolate Orange. It was invented in the 1930s. It's one of the oldest chocolate brands actually out there. It was invented after they failed to launch a chocolate apple and a chocolate lemon. But we all get it. But you're not really tasting the chocolate when you're about that. And I think that this is one of the key things about all food, and what you've got to watch for is actually, and Tim, you should probably talk a bit more about this, is when you're thinking about food and when you're thinking about different sort of tastes and textures, what is it that you really sort of want to come out, and how do you sort of detect the artificial flavoring bits to it?
Yeah, well, I guess it's the difference. If you taste a chocolate orange, we're not doing a chocolate orange tasting. You'd bite into it. You'd see it's smooth and sort of buttery. You'd get that really big hit of sugar and a sort of orangey tang, and you would get there's no after wave at all. And that's the real difference, because these are the flavorings. These are the chemicals that are added that don't have any length to it. They don't have any complexity to it, and you can't really disguise that fact. And that's the same with all ultra-processed foods. You get this initial big hit of sensations right at the front that is designed to grab your attention, but it doesn't linger. And so the only way to get more of it is to keep eating more of it, to keep that initial flavor. It's a bit of like, the bubble gum. The flavor goes pretty quickly, so you've got to have a new one. And that's really the essence of most of these processed foods, is they have a cocktail that's designed just to grab you in that first few milliseconds, and stay on your tongue and then disappear. So you go back for more. I say there's virtually nothing that I know of in any ultra-processed food that has this amazing depth of real chocolate, real good red wine, real coffee. All these ones that are complex, real plants with real chemicals interacting with your body and your microbes to produce even more chemicals. So it's just a chemical cascade, I guess, is what we're getting, which, these food companies do their best to disguise it, and there's lots of tricks to give us fake lemon flavor or orange, but they don't have that lasting effect and complexity. And we do know that ultra processed food is one of the it is our biggest problem. And the UK has the most ultra processed food in Europe, and the US has the most ultra processed food in the world. And it's not surprising that they're also linked to obesity. And we know that people who have, if you compare ultra-processed food to regular food, you will eat more of the ultra-processed food, even when you're given the same portions. It's designed specifically by chemists to have that effect on you. And so it's always the bad option when you have the choice to go for, regardless of what it says on the label.
Right. And the other angle to it as well, of course, is that when you commoditize a product, which is what's happened to cacao, not only is it not good for you, but it's certainly not good for the planet, and it's certainly not good for the farmers. And so we talked a bit about this one too, that once chocolate becomes a commodity and it's just treated like sugar or just like a vegetable fat or palm oil or anything like that, all that basically people want is they don't care about the quality, they just want the price. And so given that you've got 7 or 8 big companies basically buying all the chocolate in West Africa, and West Africa produces 70% of all the world's chocolate, and given that the average farmer owns 1 to 2 to maybe 5 hectares, so they have very, very small holdings, the disaster that's actually happening in Africa at the moment is that you get massive, massive, massive deforestation. So if you go back to the sort of, the turn of the last century, it's 1900s, 1940s even, 90% of West Africa is virgin rainforest. By 1990, it's below 30%. By 2000, it's below 10, 12%. 2015, it's below 3 or 4%. It's getting even worse. And this is because the only way the farmers can live is literally by just basically encroaching upon more and more of this virgin rainforest, even though it's protected. And the big chocolate companies know more about this. And the reason there's a question here inside it, which is that you can either plant chocolate within a rainforest, especially if it's heirloom cacao, because you need the canopy to basically cross-pollinate the cacao pods, or you can produce varietals, clones, which are much quicker growing. They don't have all the sort of richness or the complexity of chocolate, but what they do have is they are quick growing and they basically produce the valuable cocoa butter. But the other thing which is disastrous when you basically start cutting down the rainforest is this, which is what most people don't realize is actually quite how water hungry chocolate is. A chocolate bar basically ground per ground is probably even more water hungry than something like cattle. So when you take a bath, you're using 60 to 80 liters. When you're basically eating a chocolate bar, it will involve about 1.5 to 2,000 liters of water. Now, this sort of chocolate is absolutely fine because it's all recycled, because it's all grown inside the rainforest and it all recycles inside that. But in West Africa, basically places like Ghana and the Côte d'Ivoire, fairly soon, within 10 to 15 years, the combination of desertification and global warming means they just won't be able to grow cacao anymore. And then it gets even worse. So trigger warning here for anyone with young kids. The other problem is that because you've commoditized chocolate and because basically, the price of it is actually going down in real terms continually, the average cocoa farmer just doesn't get enough to live on in West Africa. So they get paid less than 80 cents a day. They need $2.50, $3 to live on. That means there's literally millions of kids who can't go to school, so they've got to help their parents there. There's even terrible cases of child slave labor. There have been attempts, but they've all been resisted by the big chocolate companies to basically try and sticker the chocolate so that you can know that it doesn't come from places where they've got child slave labor. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is basically get you to have chocolate, not only which craft is well and tastes great, but also where the beans are from, because that's the best guarantee, not only that the rainforest isn't being destroyed, not only that the farmers are being properly paid, but also that it is going to taste to be better for you. So given all that, what we now like to do is give you a conundrum, which Tim is extremely good at basically explaining and giving you how to work. So I think most of you can probably tell the difference between roast chicken and chicken nuggets when you look at them. And I'm sure you can all cook roast chicken. Even though Tim doesn't eat a lot of it, I know that he can. And I'm sure that and I'm quite sure that Tim doesn't probably ever have chicken nuggets, maybe once in every decade or something. But lots of us probably will have chicken nuggets. And we all know what the difference is. It's a chicken nugget, something you get them out of a bag, you stick them in the microwave, and Bob's your uncle. And some of you may even know actually how they make chicken nuggets, which is that you basically take any bit of the chicken you want. It can be the good stuff, it can be the detritus, what's called the slurry. You basically dehydrate it, you turn it into a powder, then you rehydrate it, you add lots of palm oils, emulsifiers, flavoring agents, additives, etc. So you all sort of get that. Now, the interesting question is, can you basically identify when we show you some bars of chocolate, which of those are made like a chicken nugget and which of those, in the sense that basically the chocolate maker just buys it in and then sort of sticks it in his equivalent of the microwave, which is his sort of tempering machine, and adds a few ingredients, and which of those are more like the roast chicken, where they're actually taking the beans, taking the chicken, and actually turning it into a lovely dish. So let's have a quick go, and you can all basically go back to Menti here, and basically we're not going to be keeping score at this point, and it is all anonymous, but it would be great for you just to try and sort of guess which ones of those are roast chicken and which ones of those are chicken nuggets. So at the moment, we seem to have lots of people who know that. Okay, we've got a few now coming in. So you guys are obviously sort of good on the brands and you all sort of recognize it, but no, we're getting slightly better. But anyway, I will stop now. So most of you are actually doing pretty well. Here are the quick answers. Cho and Bonat and Duffy's are definitely, without a doubt, roast chicken. These are guys who basically go out, work with the farmers directly. In Cho's case, the editors of Wired magazine actually literally will put little sort of factories in the jungle or crafteries in the jungle to basically sort of roast the chocolate, temper it, grind it, conch it, etc. So the farmers can taste the difference of the fermentation. Prestat, I'm afraid, despite its royal warrant, basically buys all of its what's called couverture, something invented in the 60s, which is a bit like, in the same sense that chicken nuggets, you just stick them in the oven. Effectively, that's what they're doing. And they're buying it from Domori in West Africa. Absolutely fine, nothing the matter with that. But they're not actually crafting the chocolate. Green and Blacks, same thing. Hotel Chocolat, despite them being a British grower and they're having their own estate in St. Lucia, most of the chocolate they sell, they've actually just bought in and reprocessed. Now, there is an easy way, however, with chocolate bars to basically be able to sort of tell the difference between them. And the easy way is just really all you need to do is to look at the reverse of a chocolate bar. So if you take something like and I do somewhere have it, if you take something like a bar of dairy milk and you basically turn it over, you will basically see the ingredients. So we've got here the ingredients in the US, the UK, and Australia, and underneath it we've taken a bar of Lindt. Sorry, we're not sort of beating up on the Swiss, but we are just sort of taking that just to sort of show you what's in it. And it's all those things which Tim was basically talking about as being what's inside processed food. But if you basically take a bar of craft chocolate, so if you take your bar of Pump Street and you sort of look at what's on the back of that, you should be able very simply just to sort of see that it's much, much simpler ingredients. So that's the sort of first thing that I would sort of suggest that you look at. And then, Tim, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the other stuff, sort of obviously want to know about the bean, and you obviously want to know about the maker's address.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, you can learn a lot from the label, and I think that's a general rule that goes beyond chocolate. Chocolate's a great example because it's really clear cut. But the everything else on labels, we're fooled by when you go to supermarket, the low fat, the low calorie, the gluten free, the whatever, and we don't then look at the ingredients. And if you've got 10 ingredients or you don't recognize the names of them, then that's a highly processed item that you should try and avoid. And that's really often the key. And it's just a great example here when you're even comparing things that you think are equivalent quality. So don't get fooled by these labels. That's really, really important. And of course, the general rule is it's like anything, whether you're buying cheese or you're buying chocolate or coffee, find out exactly where it's coming from. And if you know where it's coming from, exactly, the equivalent of the vineyard, then you're going to generally be spot on. And if it's some giant collective, you really have got no clue. And even worse is just, even not a collective, but just saying, just because it's Belgian or Swiss doesn't mean it's really any good. So
No.
That's a general good rule of thumb for life in all of these things. So change your idea about labels, because food companies are great at distracting you from the bits they don't want you to read by adding other stuff about vitamins and all kinds of other nonsense.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat, which I'll just quickly try and answer, which is basically, how do you know if workers are still being paid properly, even if it's single estate? So actually, it's a good question, and there's an interesting sort of answer to it, which is that we probably deal with about 150 makers. There are probably a couple of thousand people who are, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500 now, people who are actually crafting different really good beans. But actually, the number of people growing what are called heirloom cacao is much, much, much lower than that. It's probably, at most a couple of hundred. We don't know all of them, but we do know a good proportion of them. Quite a few of them we've actually visited and we've actually sort of seen. And we are pretty confident. We don't sell a bar unless we know where the beans come from, unless we actually sort of visited the maker, either virtually or in person, and we've sort of checked them that they really are, and we know where they're getting the machines from and everything else like that. But I think our real sort of aim in some ways is to try and get you to move away from the idea of mass-produced commodity chocolate, which is all about just the added flavorings and all about lowering the cost. What we'd like you to do is sort of almost treat it more like specialty coffee or the wine that you will enjoy, where you know where it's coming from, because that way we can actually get you to start thinking a bit more about the product and pay a little bit more for it, and you will have a better time and everybody else will have a better time too, I think, with it. So
there was a question here, which is quite a good one, which relates to that, is some chocolates have lecithin added, and as one of the sort of emulsifiers that's very commonly used in foods, which is really just to improve the consistency and mouthfeel, as well as acting as a bit of a preservative. And in general, Spencer and I were discussing this earlier, it's a lazy way of making your product taste better. So rather than crafting it so that it comes out really smooth and nice and has the right texture, you add a chemical to it to speed it up. It's a bit like cheating and adding other stuff to bread rather than doing your own sourdough. So in general, these extra emulsifiers and things like this do have an effect on the gut microbiome. So if you are consuming a lot of them, I'm not sure, the occasional bit probably won't hurt you, but if you had a lot of these emulsifiers and preservatives and artificial sweeteners, they all have an impact on the gut microbiome. So it's best to avoid them and, pay that little bit extra for someone who can create exactly the same smoothness without that chemical, which takes, that person cares more about the product.
Yeah, I mean, Tim is absolutely right. I mean, if you are going to use a lecithin, the one of the reasons why makers use it is exactly what Tim sort of said. It's smoothing things out. It makes the machinery run easier, to be brutally honest. There is a small argument for a few people using sunflower, not soy lecithin, like Menocal, because it's so hot where they are that without it, it's extremely hard to actually get the grinders and the conches to work. But that's about, and I do sort of sympathize a little bit with that argument there too. But if in general, if you can, basically less is more, it is much, much, much better. And it's, it really is sort of quite important to just always check your ingredients and just try and sort of work through it. Okay, so let's sort of move on to the other point, which everybody always loves to talk about, which is fats and all those other great things to do with different chocolates. Let's start by trying two different chocolates. Now, I have to apologize because this is where it gets a little bit complicated. It may be that some of you who've actually got a slightly different pair of chocolates, but it will still work. You may have either the bars from the Virunga, or you may have the bars from the Tres Hombres, which come from Honduras. It doesn't really matter which ones you've got because the same principle is there. As you're trying those two, Tim is basically going to talk a little bit about myths around fat and why fat actually isn't so terrible for you and why it can be quite good.
I think we've turned a corner in nutrition about thinking that fat is bad for you. Common myth, and that's why so many fat-free and low-fat products are sold. And it's still in the US and the UK, the nutritional guidelines say you should have low-fat products rather than full-fat products. So I know one now drinks full-fat milk. It's all skimmed or semi-skimmed or low. So the data now doesn't really support that. And most nutrition experts disagree on this. So it's no longer a consensus that fat is bad for you. And the type of fat is also important because the only fat people, even the people that are keen on it, don't like is saturated fat, which is common in meat and dairy products, but is also quite common in things that experts think are healthy, like extra virgin olive oil, and many fish. So the idea that all fats are bad or all saturated fats are bad is now gone out the window, and there's no evidence that people who reduce their saturated fat levels, actually get less heart disease. So I think it's all about the context of what you're eating. If you eat a lot of processed foods that contain saturated fat, definitely that's bad for you. And if it's all about saturated fat may or may not be good. It depends what else you swap it for, and it depends on the context. So, in general, I don't believe that saturated fat is particularly bad, although it does depend in what form you have it. If you're having it in very as part of chocolate that's high quality, then that's good. And you've got to realize that fat, although it has more calories, is generally more filling, and for low-fat products, they have to add much more sugar and other chemicals to give you that same feel. So there's absolutely no evidence, for example, that margarine is healthier for you than butter, or that low-fat yogurt is healthier for you than full-fat yogurt. So if you like the taste, always go for the full-fat one, and you can't go far wrong. So let's taste these two bars, and looks like we've got a definite winner, haven't we, here for the...
We do, and it is what we would expect for a reason that we're coming through. Although we're now sort of getting people sort of jumping onto the dark bar, which this goes to show where you are. But generally, I think that one of the great innovations which sort of made chocolate take off in the 20th century, or the 19th century, and then really take off in the 20th century, was the discovery of, first of all, conching by the Swiss, making smooth chocolate, Lindt, but also by Nestle, working out with Daniel Peter how to add milk to chocolate, because it makes it incredibly moreish. So what I'm hoping here to get is that actually at least some of you will think that the milk chocolate is pretty moreish, probably more moreish than the dark bar. And generally what happens when we give people milk chocolate is people savor the dark chocolate. They like the milk chocolate too. And by the way, all these milk chocolates that you're trying are very high percentage. So they're over 40%. Put it in context, a bar of something like Bourneville is only 39% cacao. And it doesn't have much butter in it either. It'll be mainly the cacao solids because they'll be using the cocoa butter elsewhere for other stuff. But sort of what's fun is to actually understand why and how this is happening, because actually the Swiss accidentally discovered, arguably almost like 100 years before ultra processed food discovered what's called the bliss point. You know, the whole point behind Pringles is once you pop, you can't stop. The combination of sugar, salt, and fat works in a completely different way. And if you want another example of this, now that you're all sort of savoring those two chocolate bars and sort of going for it, the other chocolate, which is sort of quite fun to try, is the Menacao milk. So if you try the Menacao milk now, I'd love you actually just to try and describe what flavors you get out of this. And just this one particular impression that we're looking for, which will explain another sort of slightly odd fact, which is that when I show you the 63% and the 44%, most people are slightly bemused to discover that actually they've got the same amount of added sugar. And the reason why they can have the same amount of added sugar is because what you're getting out of the Menacao milk here is the milk itself. The butterscotch is exactly the sort of word that I'm looking for, or caramel is the other word, because one of the tricks that chocolate makers have got is that if you basically add milk powder when you're grinding and conching it under high temperature, what actually happens is you bring out the sugars inside the milk, and you don't need to add anything else. That just makes it naturally sweet. So we actually have some what we call dark milks, which don't have any added sugar. They just have milk to them, but they are very, very, very sort of moreish because of the milk which is inside it. So yeah. Tim, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, which one do you prefer? Do you prefer your Tres Hombres or your Gorilla Bar, or are you more of a Menacao milk fan?
I guess I could be swayed on either. I'm more of a dark chocolate person, so but I guess the Tres Hombres for me, I think, is the.
That's great. Okay, and again, as we sort of said, this is really just to sort of, again, it's all about reading the label. Those of you who've now learned to read the label, and actually the first person who sort of got this bar picked it up immediately, they picked up the word salt, which has now sort of disappeared. But if you look at actually what chocolate makers do, they understand what Moscovitz discovered in the 1970s, 1960s, which is that human beings, when you add sugar, salt, and fat together, hit this thing called the bliss point. And it basically means it's just, we don't know how to say no anymore. It's the sort of, it's the Pringles. It's the, once you pop, you just can't stop. And I think, Tim, you're extremely articulate in basically explaining why we shouldn't have this sort of artificial food. And I think this is just one of the elements to it.
Yeah, exactly. And once you realize that, you're liking it because some chemist has just put them all together after masses of testing on different people to say, which one are you going to stuff your face with and feel slightly sick after you've eaten it, then it changes your idea of having a fun snack. But we're all susceptible to them, so I think that's the other reason. But going for these chocolates that have this much greater depth of flavour rather than that sort of quick hit, so it does grow on you. So it is hard to go back with this good stuff, and that's why it's good every now and again to remind yourself what cheap chocolate's like, and how nasty something like Cadbury's Bourneville is. Which in my youth was seen as the luxury in high content chocolate.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that is one of the reasons why we're so keen on basically pushing this thing, which Professor Barry Smith and Rebecca Palmer and James Hoffman help us develop, along with Tim. It's basically just thinking about it's the length of flavor that you get when you eat a natural food is completely different to a processed food. And I think it's just one of the things we just have to sort of get back into getting used to. And basically just trying to get you to eat more and more of it because you get that instant satisfaction is not a good sign. Right. Tim, I think what we're going to try and do now is hold a quiz for everybody, which you've sort of helpfully basically got everything, sort of the answers together, and we will give some people some chocolate who win it at the end. And you can sort of announce what the different answers are, because I'll probably get them wrong, and hopefully I did get them right in the quiz. And then we're going to open it up to some more questions.
I've had too much wine. I can't get them wrong as well.
Right. So hopefully we're going to go now. And actually, there were some questions which I'll try and get back to in a sec. Okay. So again, you just need to be on menti.com. Polyphenols are poisonous for plants, energy for your gut microbiomes, plentiful and Nesquik, or slightly sweet. You've got a good audience here, Tim.
Yeah, very, very, very educated, brainy lot.
Oh, good lot. Right. Yeah.
Obviously into their gut microbes, this lot.
And then we did actually sort of give the answer to this one, I think, earlier on. Which has got the most added sugar to it? Low-fat yogurts, dark chocolate, milk chocolate, high dark milk chocolate, or flat whites? Again, it's a good audience.
Yeah, doing very well there. Be very aware of the low-fat product.
Yeah. So which of the following is true? Breakfast is important. 4 cups of coffee is good for your heart. Fish oil supplements. Steaming vegetable destroys their nutrients and polyphenols. This one is a bit trickier.
Yeah, we haven't discussed this, so this will really test them. See if any of them read my book already.
No, not enough people
got
have.
A bit of a split there.
Yeah, no, it's definitely the cups of coffee. We haven't yet managed to prove it for chocolate. In fact, actually, most of the evidence for chocolate is very dubious. There's a lot of nonsense written about chocolate being good for your heart. It's based on a tribe called the Cuna Indians, just off Panama. And it may be true for them, although it may also be the fish that they're having. But they're basically also having unfermented cacao, which also seems to be quite rich in the polyphenols. And it's not at all clear that it is for chocolate. There's lots of other things that chocolate's really, really good for you on in terms of savouring. It's very good for your microbiome and stuff like that. Proper chocolate without the stuff, all the additives and everything else like that. But it's not as clear as with coffee yet. But maybe we'll get some more studies to do.
These are all myths that I discuss in the book that we probably won't have time to cover. But definitely coffee, it seems to be, regardless of caffeine, So again, it's the polyphenols in the coffee that are likely to be good, just like it's likely but not proven that high quality chocolate is probably also good for you in the same way that olive oil is good, and all these things with very high polyphenol counts. So that's the reason for that. Breakfast is not the most important meal of the day, although we're brainwashed from being children to believe that. And there's absolutely no evidence that children who don't want to eat breakfast do badly at school. And that was a myth that's been around, probably promoted by the food companies like Mr. Kellogg, as well as another myth that if you skip breakfast, you're more likely to get fat. That's another complete myth. So, and the other ones is one of my fish oil supplements. The vitamin people are always spending millions of dollars and pounds telling us how vitamins work. When you put them in trials, they just don't work at all. And fish oil is clearly, it has no benefit at all when you have them as supplements. Fish probably has a very weak effect. It's certainly not bad for you, but may not be as good for you as we think. And the idea that steaming vegetables destroys the nutrient polyphenols is wrong. So that comes back to this raw versus cooked idea again. So lots of myths about food that the science doesn't really bear out.
Yeah.
So that's the only one you guys didn't do really brilliantly on.
Well, there's still one more, Tim, which is the embarrassing one for you, which basically sort of goes through all of your great skills, which we're going to go to. Actually, I'm just going to do one more thing on raw, which I forgot to mention earlier on, but one person gently reminded me of in the a little story about raw chocolate too, which is that one of the other reasons why you roast a product like cacao is not just because it brings out the flavor, but also because it destroys lots of the nasty botulisms and anthrax and other things which you can sometimes get from fermented but not roasted cacao beans. And in fact, we had an Australian raw chocolate maker, which I won't name, but there aren't that many of them, so you can probably guess. And when we asked them what they did to basically make certain that the cacao they were using, if they didn't roast it, didn't have botulism and didn't have any anthrax in it, they wrote back to us and said that they froze it. And this is slightly puzzling because if you know anything about anthrax, the way in which you store anthrax is that you freeze it. So this did not encourage us to go out and buy any more of this stuff. So basically raw chocolate, they don't even really understand the science behind them is sort of the moral from this story. Right, Tim, this is the embarrassing one for you because you are a man of many, many, many talents. And the question is, which one of the following have you so far not yet managed to do? So your career so far does not include which one of these four? Rheumatology, epidemiology, genetics, or dermatology? Everyone can have a guess. Now, I sort of know you a little bit, so I did manage to get this one right, but that would be about the end. That's pretty impressive. They obviously all have read your books, but what they don't realize, of course, is that your wife is a dermatologist and an extraordinarily accomplished one too. So basically, if we sort of said, in a way, it does include your personal career. So the answer could therefore be that it probably is all right. Okay.
Easily pretend to be a dermatologist, yeah.
So drum roll here. And you are a good rheumatologist because you told me what to do with my knee. So drum roll, let's see how we all did and see who wins. Now, so it looks to me as if Jenna, whoever Jenna is, you have to sort of write into us. You did very, very well. But if you've got, Tim, a little bit of time, maybe we can sort of take some questions from the chat. But while we're doing that, a huge thank you to you. And just a quick recap of the stuff, which is basically, read the label, check and trust your gut. I mean, that's the sort of basically look for the ingredients, figure out where the estate and the beans are from, where the factory address is. Don't trust words like raw or Belgium. If you only spend like £1 on this, you are fooling yourself. I mean, the great thing about craft chocolate is for £4 to £5 to £6, you can get an amazing bit of chocolate. And the other thing is you should always have 2 craft chocolates on the go. And please join our Months of Discovery service. And even more importantly, for Christmas, please, please, please think about giving everybody Tim's great book, because it is an awesome book. I was fortunate enough to read it in draft form, and it is just absolutely brilliant, but also with some of his favorite chocolates. So thank you, Tim, very, very much for this. We will be making it available with all the nasty bits cut out as a sort of YouTube video, I think, too, and we will try and basically get Tim back at some point as well. There were some questions that I didn't cover earlier on for you, Tim. There's one about sunflower lecithin, but there were a few about like your microbiome as well. I think that some people had, and I'm not quite sure where they were. But anyway, if you want to sort of ask any more of those questions, why sunflower lecithin rather than soya lecithin is one question. So I'm not a chemist or an expert, and Tim will probably be able to answer this one better than me. My understanding is partly that the soya lecithin can be, it's partly because the soy lecithin is grown in a way which is actually more harmful for the planet. And then there is also a little bit of the theory that it's more processed. But I really am not an expert on that. But I have to say that given that all the chocolate makers are moving to sunflower, I think there must be something in it because they would have done the research. And then there was a very interesting question about why do you sometimes love chocolate on one day but be neutral and about the same chocolate the next day? I don't know the answer to this, but I have exactly the same thing, Janet. And the only theory that I got from any other industry is what's sort of called root and leaf days when you have wines. And I don't know if you know this, but basically whenever a supermarket or a big wine company actually does a wine tasting, they will look at the biodynamic calendar because they insist that people taste differently in different phases of the moon. And I think this is an extremely attractive theory. I don't have any evidence that it's right or wrong, but you definitely are right. I mean, Tim, maybe, and this is passing it over to you, is it anything to do with the fact what else you've eaten may well be impacting your microbiome and how that's going to react with you, or what else is it?
Yeah, I mean, we know we've been doing these predict studies on thousands of people, giving them identical meals and we see an 8-fold difference in their response to the identical meal. And even identical twins have a different response to food. And so we looked at, well, if it's not genes and it's not just, the carbs and the fat, what is it that makes this difference in how our body responds to food? Because what's going on inside our blood is also probably what's also changing in terms of flavors in our mouth, although we're not measuring it directly. And it turns out there's lots of things happen. So how much sleep you had the night before can affect how your body you break down food and how you respond to it. What you ate the night before or the meal before changes your body's response to an identical meal. So there are these and whether you exercised or not. So there are all these extra variables that we know change how your body metabolizes food. That would, if we translate that to saying, well, how you break down food in your mouth to get the flavors, then logically there is that big difference. So I think it does explain it. So as well as all of us being unique in the tastes and flavors and the way we deal with food, about whether we put on weight or lose weight, I think our ability to taste, it not only is unique, but will change from day to day. And so it's just understand the complexity of food, which is all about 26,000 chemicals now, not just carbs, fats and protein. It's massive interactions of all these chemicals with all our 2,000 species of bugs and our 20,000 genes and everything. It's a complicated network, and that's why we're so different, and that's why it's so fun.
Yeah, I think that was good. There are two other questions, Tim, which I think are more directed at you than they are at me, but I'll give my personal evidence on them as well after you. One of them is Dutching, alkalinization of chocolate, which was sort of invented along with the cocoa press by the Van Houtens, which basically sort of means that you wash the cocoa powder in an alkalized solution to make it slightly less bitter, also take some of the color out of it. It is known that it is often said that it basically destroys lots of the nutrients and lots of the polyphenols inside there. So the question is that less good for your gut? That was one question.
Well, if it's true, it is. I think there's still some debate about how much is destroyed in that process. But anything that any of those chemicals, nutrients you take out, you will lose some complexity of flavor. You gain uniformity, which is what a lot of the big producers like, but you might reduce that individuality about the food. And generally, we want diversity of polyphenols. We want the more chemicals going into our gut microbes, the better.
Yeah. And then there's another question about, does dark chocolate have a different blood sugar response to lower percentage chocolates?
Yes, your blood sugar response will basically be about a balance between the sugar, the fat, and the fiber in the chocolate. And so the greater the percentage of sugar to fat or sugar to fiber, the bigger the peak in your sugar will be. Basically, when I tested myself, when I'm eating 70% or more dark chocolate, I don't really see a major peak in my blood sugar. If I'm having, a cheap Cadbury's milk chocolate, I see a very major peak in my blood sugar, despite the amount of fat in there.
Yeah, I've done the same experiments on me. I actually added in some dark milk chocolate. So basically, the cacao percentage is slightly lower in a dark milk, but the added sugar is slightly higher, is slightly lower as well. And what I've actually discovered is that actually that has an even lower sort of spike for me than even a 70% will have. So like a 55 or a 65% dark milk actually will cause me to spike less than a 70% dark. And interestingly, if I have it with a glass of wine, it spikes even lower. So wine and chocolate for me actually causes things to spike lower, whereas coffee causes me to spike really, really high.
We should definitely do an experiment together on that to check it.
Oh, we'll definitely do that one again together, yeah. And then there's another one about, does chocolate have any addictive qualities? Or is it only to do with the sugar and the fat qualities? So I have read about this, about theobromine and about the caffeine. So let me answer the caffeine one, because I'm pretty sure about this one, which is that there is a little bit of caffeine in some chocolate, but the amount you have to eat is just staggering to get addicted to it. Whereas basically to get addicted to coffee, in the sense of basically giving you withdrawal symptoms after a couple of weeks, I think it's like 7 or 8 cups of coffee, which will actually sort of do that. The equivalent inside chocolate, I think, is the theobromine. But I think you have to eat something like 10 bars of chocolate a day of high percentage cacao to get anywhere near that. So, Jonathan, if you write to me, it was actually I think I wrote about this about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and it is on the blog. We've got something there too. Tim may well have better. Tim generally has got much better information than any of this stuff, because I'm not getting it all from him.
No, I agree with all that. There's no real evidence of chocolate addiction other than as you said, the manufactured bliss points. So yeah, you can eat good chocolate without any worries about getting addicted to it, and that's why a good bar will fill you up pretty quickly. You can't just have 5 bars.
No, in fact, we don't even think you can normally have 1 bar. So when you subscribe to us, which we're hopefully all going to do, you actually, one of the first things we give you is a little bag to store the chocolate that you haven't eaten inside there. So 2 more questions that we've got now, which is, Tim, this is one for you, which is, what sort of red wine do you like to have with your chocolate? And then I'll give some other answers about what we can match.
Well, I like good red wine, and I'm currently drinking a Rioja.
Yeah, that would be very good. I think anything with good tannins in it works very well with chocolate, I think. And then I think you can match the flavors.
It's got to be substantial, I think, and ideally not too fruity, so it doesn't sort of detract from the chocolate.
Yeah, not a Pinot probably, but like Cabernet Franc goes really well with Ecuadorian chocolate. And then there's another one, which is the benefit of roasting cacao. Is it harmful to eat unroasted cacao beans? So if you're careful, the answer to this is no. We do actually have a couple of makers who consciously decide not to roast their beans. This great New York company called Raka, run by Nate. And they're fascinating. It's a very, very different flavor profile. And there's a Welsh guy over here called Pablo Spall, who runs something called Forever Cacao, and a couple of other makers too. They are extremely careful, though, to check that there are no bugs and botulism inside their chocolate. I basically, if you can sort of afford the test that they're doing and you want to eat some sort of unroasted cacao beans, that's, I think, absolutely fine. So, there is a huge difference between raw and unroasted. Raw is a nonsense claim. Unroasted is, you just got to be a bit more careful with it then.
Is that a bit like unpasteurized cheese, do you think? It's sort of
yeah,
equivalent, that there's some minute risk, but it's, most people who enjoy food will say it's minute and enjoy it.
Yeah. And I think, Tim, you're also being encouraged to go to Brazil and try some sort of try some of the pulp, which is delicious when you drink it too. We do actually occasionally get cacao pods brought to us over here, so we've tried it ourselves here too. Okay, so sorry, we didn't answer your question about baking and cooking chocolate. So the reason why emulsifiers are added to baking and cooking chocolate is to make it easier for you to mold and to enrobe. And that is true, but it is what Tim sort of said. It does make your life a bit easier, but arguably anything like an emulsifier is not going to be particularly, it's not as good as if you can do without it. That was half of the answer to your question. Your second question, Jane, was about Valrhona. Yeah, so Valrhona is interesting. So Valrhona are one of the first guys who sort of introduced the idea of single estate small batch chocolate way back in the 1980s, 1990s, along with Bonap. Depending on which couverture you're buying from them, I mean, look, again, I just strongly recommend you read the ingredients. If there's a particular flavor profile that you like Manjari, bluntly, I would suggest that you come to us and you buy Menacao, because they're the same beans, but they are not processed in the same big factories, and they won't have as much blend, shall we say, on top of it. So does that, Jane, does that sort of slightly answer your question a bit more? I mean, look, emulsifiers make life easier. That's the reason why the French put them in all of their couverture. That's not an argument for having it. I mean, chicken nuggets are easier than roast chicken. It's not an argument against it either. It's a tiny amount. The question about which couverture should you use is a lot more sophisticated. I mean, again, you've got to know where the beans come from, because otherwise you are dealing with, you just like, you don't buy blended wines and, you don't sort of buy, an EU wine, you buy a nice French Chateau. And I think it's that sort of principle that I would sort of think that you probably have a bit more go. Tim, I'm very conscious of the fact that you've been up for a very long time, and I know that you've been swimming today and everything else. So we might sort of like, say one final hurrah if anyone hasn't got any more questions or stuff for you. But I cannot thank Tim, first of all, enough. Secondly, I strongly recommend Tim's book. I learned a ton from it. It's definitely changed what I do. And thirdly, I would definitely recommend all of his microbiome stuff and studies. I mean, I was very lucky to be one of the early people trying it, and it's radically changed my breakfast. Thanks to Tim, I've discovered that what I have to have when I do have breakfast, and I like breakfast in the morning, is I need to have a bit of protein. I've discovered that is much better for me than a cup of porridge. And it was an extraordinary discovery, which was really, really valuable. So thank you, Tim, for that. And thank you very, very much for all of your time.
My pleasure. It's been one of my more fun talks. So eating chocolate and drinking wine and chatting about gut is a real pleasure compared to most of the stuff I do. So thank you, everybody, for all the amazing questions. And I look forward to meeting you again or sometime. But just remember, when you're eating, you can't go far wrong if you just think of your gut, think what your microbes want, and keep experimenting. I think that's the key. Don't get in a rut. Keep trying new foods, new flavors, and that's the key to
new chocolate bars. 4 of them every month.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Keep your taste buds tickled.
Yeah, okay. Always new ones for you to try. Thank you very, very much, Tim. I can't thank you enough. I'm sorry, everybody, about sort of the unpleasantness earlier on. We will try and edit that out when we post this thing on YouTube. But thank you very, very much, everybody. Yeah, Tim, can't thank you enough. Thank you. Thank you so much, and good night.